How we doing, everyone? Dr. Stringer back to talk to you about the characteristics and structure of the police organization today. Hopefully you all already read Chapter 3 in your textbook, so I'm just going to talk about it a little bit. The characteristics and structure of police organizations is pretty straightforward, so I wouldn't fret too much about that, and we're going to talk about that briefly. When you look at the characteristics and structures of police organizations, like I said before, I usually have a big discussion question part of the class when I teach this face to face, but you all don't get the benefit of all of that. But do keep in mind that you might see some of these questions again as your discussion boards, and you might even see discussion questions on your tests. So something to think about, these questions as you work your way through the material. And they're good kind of guided reading questions, I think, too, if you haven't read the chapters yet, to kind of think about the answers to these questions as you're reading your chapter. So I like to display them up there briefly for you all. The bureaucracy of police agencies. It has five core principles. One is the division of labor, which results in specialization. And so what I mean by that is that, in your bigger departments, you're going to have a lot more specialization. You're going to have some people that do patrol, some that do investigations. You're going to have, police chiefs and captains, lieutenants, sergeants, even some majors in there underneath the chief. And then you'll have, your just regular patrolmen, your detectives, investigations, things like that. But then in your smaller departments, you're not really going to have as much of a division of labor, and we'll talk about that here in a couple of minutes. The other thing that comes mainly, from military is kind of this idea of the hierarchy of authority, this chain of command, so to speak. So your average patrol officer, if he has a question, he's not going to go all the way to the chief. If he has a question, he's not going to get his orders right from the chief unless he's messed up really bad. So usually what will happen is there's a chain of command. The chief will tell the majors what to do. The majors will tell the captain, lieutenant, sergeant, and it goes all the way down the rank and file. And this also is important, too, because you have different ranks here. So the captain has to listen to the major, but he doesn't have to, he doesn't take orders from the sergeant. So this is pretty self-explanatory, so I won't get into, too much of that and waste too much time on it. And then there's rules, a lot of policies and procedures. This is very similar to the division of labor in that in your larger departments, you're going to have a lot more policies, procedures for a lot of different stuff. In your smaller departments, you don't usually have that much. And you can have policies on use of force, uniforms, traffic stops. You guys have probably heard of a lot of, use of force policies and revamping them right now. Before that, you probably heard a lot about police pursuit policies and how a lot of departments were instituting policies that they weren't going to engage in pursuits if they felt that they could catch the person afterwards, and it was kind of going to, be a danger to the community to engage in that pursuit. Impersonal relationships, you're supposed to be objective. People are supposed to get promoted based upon their abilities and what they've accomplished, and not because they're buddies with the sergeant and things like that. And I'd say this is a core principle. I'm going to say, that this is actually how things always work in an ideal world, right? And then competence-based selection and training. That goes along with your impersonal relationships and your objectivity. That it's based on your competence and your training, and not just, how close you are with people that are higher up. So one of the interesting things, and I think your book talks about this, is that the agency kind of has a monopoly. Those of you that live around here are kind of in a different situation than a lot of places are across the country, because you have a lot of different agencies within the same place, especially when it comes to being on campus. And so ordinarily, if you have a police issue, you call 911 and you have one agency that, is going to respond. So if you're in Ackworth, You have the Ackworth police they have the monopoly on, the policing of that area. So it's not like a business. It's not like you can pick, well, I want this police department to respond. Because Marietta is not going to come to your house if you're in Ackworth. Marietta PD is not going to come out there, even if you request them. So there's not like there's a big competition, right? You don't get to choose between agencies. Here it's kind of interesting because we have dual jurisdiction for many cases, such as, with the Cobb County Police. Cobb County Police won't usually respond to anything that's not in the unincorporated part of Cobb, but they do still have jurisdiction, even in the cities and stuff, although, you still don't get to choose them. And the same thing goes with, if you're in Marietta or Ackworth, wherever you are, right? So the Cobb County Police before I moved here, I'd never heard of a county police department. Usually you have a county sheriff's department. We have a county sheriff's department here as well, but we also have a county police department, which I think is interesting. Anyway, and so the only real choice that you have is whether you want to call the police or not. And like I said, here we have more of a choice than most places do. So in thinking about that, even though there's a monopoly, citizens still have some recourse, right? So even if you do, you don't like this police department, you still have to have this police department. But as we've seen most recently, you can have protests and riots to kind of boycott this police department, so to speak, right? And the department is still accountable to its elected officials. Police chiefs are appointed by usually the mayor or governor or, whatever. It depends on what locality they're in. And they're also accountable to the federal government, to the Department of Justice. So the Justice Department can actually come in and, investigate police officers, police departments. The DOJ did a big investigation on the Ferguson Police Department right after all of that was going on. With the Michael Brown shooting, they actually did an investigation into the Michael Brown shooting itself as well. And they actually found that while there wasn't evidence to prosecute the officer in that case, their investigation of the Ferguson Police Department did find a lot of big issues with the Ferguson Police Department being racially biased and things like that. And then there's also civil violations. So under Section 1983 of the U.S. Code, you can actually sue police officers for breaching your civil rights in federal courts. For a long time, you couldn't do that. You had to take them to state court, which is a little bit of a conflict of interest since they're usually state officers, but you can actually take them to federal court now. But anyway. So there's this idea of what's known as the street-level bureaucracy, that this public agency serves primarily low-income clients and workers, and they have a substantial amount of discretion. They're very much, police officers, police departments are very much like schools, courts, public health, homeless shelters, other welfare agencies, because they process people, right? They provide some services or sanctions, and then they rely on tax money, right? And most of the clients are poor. You don't get too many rich people going through there. And then the employees are kind of these street-level bureaucrats, right? They're the decision makers. They decide whether someone's going to be arrested or not. And that typically changes them. They have a lot of discretion. I like to call the police the gatekeepers of the criminal justice system, because if the police don't arrest you, then you're not going to have anything to do with the criminal justice system. But when the police arrest you, that starts you along that long trajectory of the entire criminal justice process. So then the police essentially become the gatekeepers of the process, right? So some challenges to managing police organizations. Management of discretion. That's a real big one because, some people, and we'll talk about discretion later on in the class, but discretion is one of those things that it's like, well, how much discretion do we want to give police officers? Do we want zero discretion, or do you want, 100% discretion? Think about arresting those little old ladies that are betting quarters, playing bingo. Technically, that's gambling and is illegal. But, would you go and arrest the little old ladies that are, gambling and playing bingo? Another issue with discretion is, and I usually have my students raise their hands at how many people actually drive the speed limit. But for those of you that are, here virtually, just think about how often you drive the speed limit. Well, technically, they can pull you over and write you a ticket for going 56 in a 55, right? But they exercise some discretion. They'll usually let you go 65 or 70 unless they, and then they won't stop you. And so that's an exercise of discretion. To take that away would, especially with speeding, give officers a whole lot to do, right? They'd have to be pulling over and stopping a lot of people because so few people actually drive the speed limit. And then there's this big issue with the street cops versus the management cops, and we'll get into that some when we talk about the police culture. But police officers have a lot of discretion, and so when the administration says, hey, we're going to do this and we want y'all to do this, well, it's kind of hard for them to make sure that that happens because of the culture, because the officers could say, well, we're just not going to do that, and we all collectively decided on this, and we're just not going to tell on anybody else that does this. And then there's resource constraints and demands for services, right? You only have but so many dollars in your budget and so many police officers. And so if you went with 100% enforcement and zero discretion and you had to arrest everybody or give a ticket to everybody who broke the speed limit, even by 1 mile an hour, you're taking a lot of your officers and putting them to where they're dealing with this all the time, right? And that could potentially allow some of your other crimes to seep through the cracks, right? Because the officers are so preoccupied with the speeding issue, they're not allowed to use their discretion. And so the officers might use discretion like that to determine what crimes are most important that they enforce in their jurisdiction, right? They might decide, well, hey, we've got a big drug problem here. Let's focus on that. Or we've had a lot of fatal car accidents, so let's focus on that. And so that discretion gives them the ability to do that. And then there's, these kind of these ambiguous and difficult to achieve goals sometimes, right? So we're supposed to be fighting crime and stopping crime, but how are we supposed to do that? What defines crime as going down? Is it less arrests? Well, if that's the case, we'll just arrest less people this month, and then we'll say, hey, crime went down. Look, we've only had 10 arrests for loitering. Even though everybody that drives down the street can say, well, I see all these people loitering, you guys just stopped enforcing it as much. But anyway, so moving along. So looking at kind of the structure of police departments, one thing that I like to look at too and make you all aware of is the gender bias in policing, right? It probably doesn't come as a big surprise to you that the vast majority of police officers are male, right? And this has changed, over time. But you do see that at the very most, 17% of the officers are, well, I guess if you round it up, 18% of the officers are female and most are male. Now you see that as the size of the departments goes up, you see more female officers. The female officers have actually, I don't remember if I have a slide that shows how they've gone over time, but female officers have actually gotten to be much more prolific within policing, especially within the past few decades, because now we're not allowing male officers to search female suspects, and females are often getting arrested for drugs and things like that, where they need to, search them to make sure that they don't have any drugs on them, and so they're only allowing female officers to do this. And a lot of departments are trying to have at least one or two female officers on each shift, so that way they can call a female officer if a female needs to be searched. So you're seeing that a little bit more, which is a good thing. And so I wanted to show you all kind of how this works here. And you look at, different departments. So you look at Houston, Texas. You got a population of 2 million. You got 5,000 police officers. That's a lot of police officers. Houston has a very large department. And then you look at maybe Watertown, Massachusetts. It's got 32,000 people and 69 officers. And then Creighton, Nebraska, which is a population of 7,000 people. They only have 11 officers. And I want to break this down and show you the organizational charts across these different sized police departments. So here's the Crate, Nebraska organizational chart. You see in Crate, Nebraska, remember you only have 9 officers. So you have a chief, you have a lieutenant, and then you have communications, patrol, support, and investigations. Investigations just has 1 sergeant, and that's it, right? And so then you have a communications supervisor, and then you have a couple of dispatchers. Patrol, you have a sergeant, and then you have your patrol officers. Support, you have a sergeant, you have community services officers, and then you've got some volunteer people down here, right? The police explorers, the college interns, and the reserve police officers. This is a really, really small police department. It doesn't get much smaller than this, other than your Mayberry Police Department, where you have a sheriff and a deputy. And you all know that's a TV show, of course. So here's Watertown, Massachusetts. And remember, they had a few more officers there. They had, I don't recall how many they had off the top of my head. They had 69 officers. And so here you're kind of divided a little bit more. You have the chief of police, and then you have operations, and then administration over here. And so under operations, you have your day-to-day stuff that's going on, right? Patrol, traffic, dispatch. And then over administrative services, you have your civilian staff, your detectives, community staff, and development. And I'd encourage you all to look at, I put the Cobb County PD organizational chart, I believe, on D2L for you all to look at that one too, as I thought y'all would be interested in that. You can see in Houston, you got a lot more division, right? You have a lot more specialties. Even within the detective unit, you have, investigations unit, but then you have an auto theft investigations, you have a gang unit, you have a major crimes, you have narcotics. I can't read what some of these say, vehicular crimes. And then you got burglary, homicide. So you got all these different types of just detective agencies in there. And I can't read most of these, but you can see within field operations, you've got your north precinct, east precinct, south precinct. So you've got your different precincts. And then under that, you've got, central, north, and northeast. So, you've got air support. This is just going to show you that, the bigger departments just have a huge amount of specialization. Now, I know none of you can read this, and I can't read it either, but I'd just like to display it and show you. This is the LAPD, and I don't think this is in your book. This is the LAPD organizational chart. In case you don't know, LAPD is like the largest police department in the country. And you can see, you've got just tons of different organizations here. And the reason why this structure and hierarchy works so well is because the chief of police up here, he could never manage telling all of these individual people what to do. So that's why the chain of command flows down to where he's telling, this guy what to do, and then he tells this person tells this person, and then it flows on down the line to whoever needs to know to take some of that workload off of people, which is a good thing to do. Just to talk about, a few of the major operating units in your larger departments. Of course, you're going to have patrol. Pretty much every department has patrol. Now, people on patrol might do different things at different times, but everybody's got patrol, whether it be automotive, foot, motorcycle, bicycle, whatever. You usually have a traffic unit. When I lived back in Virginia, I used to always tell everybody, I said, when you see an unmarked car, it's either a traffic unit or it's a detective. And the way you tell is if it's got a whole lot of blue lights in it and cameras and stuff all up on the dash, then that's a traffic unit. So if the traffic unit sees you, you need to slow down because their primary job is to write tickets. And so if they stop you, you're probably going to get a ticket. You can get stopped by a patrol officer depending upon where you live and their importance of traffic. They might stop you and just tell you to slow down and move on their way, depending upon what their discretion is and their SOPs and stuff like that. But the traffic officers, they're just enforcing traffic, kind of like a state trooper. So that's their, they don't have as much discretion because that's their job. Their sole thing is to write tickets. Whereas a patrol officer, he might, see someone speeding, and he's like, well, yeah, but we've got, a robbery that, is going to occur down the street, or we've got to march to this bar where people often fight at and stuff like that. So they've got a lot more to deal with. Anyway, so criminal investigations, that's your detectives. And then tactical enforcement, that's your SWAT teams and stuff like that. They handle your high-risk situations. The youth or juvenile bureau, a lot of times the bigger departments will have special detectives or what are called youth services officers, but some of you have probably seen at your schools when you were in high school and junior high and stuff, your youth services officers. They're a whole different division. Your communications, those are your dispatchers. And then you have internal affairs. A lot of departments have started calling this the Office of Professional Standards, but that's not a whole lot different. And they investigate complaints against officers. And then you have crime analysis, which are your people that do crime mapping and stuff like that. And then there's different types of agencies. You have your local police agency, your county sheriffs, your state police, special jurisdiction agencies like KSU PD. They're just there for the university, and then your federal agencies. And you guys can read all about all those in your book, so I won't bore you too much with that. Okay? So that is all I had to talk about for the structure and organization of agencies. So please don't forget to do your discussion board and your quizzes, and I will talk to you all next week. Thanks.